Hello, and welcome to this Australia-New Zealand Women's Declaration International webinar for June 2024. My name is Janet Fraser, coming to you from Gundungurra, west of Sydney. I'm the convener of the Feminist Legal Clinic in Exile. Tonight I have Bronwyn Williams and Marcella from the Feminist Legal Clinic doing tech with me. Wherever you're coming from this evening, we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and particularly the women of this continent. We have 3 speakers tonight whom I'll introduce in turn. A reminder that the presentation is recorded and question time is not. When we end for question time, I'd appreciate it if women use the Q&A box for written questions so I don't lose them in the chat. If you wish to speak after we promote you, please use the raise your hand icon and I will keep a running list of the order in which I see you appear. And now to introduce our excellent panel. Megan Blake has a degree in law from the University of Melbourne and a PhD in hermeneutics and interpretation from Monash University. She has worked in policy, research and project management and has taught at secondary and tertiary levels. Megan's advocacy and volunteer work has focused on women's rights and refugee support, and she is currently working with the Feminist Legal Clinic in its representation of the Lesbian Action Group regarding an application for a single-sex exemption under the Commonwealth Sex Discrimination Act. Denise Thompson is an independent scholar who has been reading, researching, writing, thinking about, and sometimes publishing feminist theory for decades. She is an academic writer who has a PhD in sociology from the University of New South Wales for a thesis called Against the Dismantling of Feminism, a Study in the Politics of Meaning. It was later published by Sage under the title of Radical Feminism Today. Apart from her PhD, all her work has been done outside academe, while any paid academic work she has had has been sporadic, largely casual, and unconnected to her feminist work. Alecia Staines has run some of Australia's biggest maternity campaigns, including the Bush Baby campaign. She is passionate about women having access to local maternity services. As a result of some of her campaigning, she's had governments direct over $100 million into maternity services in the last 12 months. Her organisation helped set up the New South Wales Birth Trauma Inquiry, and she regularly provides advice and submissions to government on how to improve maternity services for women. Thank you for being here, everyone. And I would like to start off by inviting Megan to speak. Megan, take it away.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm here. June has been a big month for TERF news. So I'm just here to give a June update that I've called So Long June, and thanks for all the fish. So on the 8th of June, Natasha Stott-Despoja was re-elected to the UN CEDAW committee. So the CEDAW committee is made up of 23 independent experts from around the world, and their job is to monitor the implementation of CEDAW in member states. So that means Stott-Despoja is not acting as a representative of Australia, but she is the only member from the Pacific region. So arguably easier for Australian lobbyists and government to access, and perhaps more aware of and sympathetic to local issues. In an interview in 2023, however, Stott-Despoja argued that advances in gender equality have been unequally spread since her time in Parliament. She said, "These experiences are compounded for women of colour, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, lesbian and trans women, and for women with disabilities." At the 2018 Chief Executive Women Annual Conference, talking about harmful gender stereotypes holding women back, she said the same sentence. Her second term with CEDAW commences on the 1st of January 2025 when this one ends. In other news, Teddy Cook has announced resignation from ACON as Community Health Director. No reasons were disclosed and there seems to be no immediate plan for future work, but it's unclear whether this is related to the recent Billboard Chris case, where Chris Elston in February shared a Daily Mail article about Cook, who also works on a WHO gender guidelines panel and works with the UN, and tweeted about Cook's self-publicised interests in bondage fetish behaviours and other things such as drug use. The eSafety Commissioner sent a removal notice to Elston with the threat of a $782,000 fine. It was classified as cyber abuse. The notice said that the tweet was intended to cause serious harm to the complainant because the material misgendered the complainant and reiterated that the point was deliberate, which was likely intended to invalidate and mock the complainant's gender identity. The material also contained a statement that implicitly equated transgender identity with a psychiatric condition. In a parliamentary hearing on the 30th of May, the eSafety Commissioner was questioned about this. Liberal Senator Claire Chandler asked her about the office's enforcement of pronoun usage and how that sat alongside the fact that a violent rapist can be housed in a women's prison and called she. The Commissioner replied, "I fail to see the connection." The Commissioner also admitted a potential conflict of interest with her prior relationship with ACON, but said she did not know Cook personally. The case is ongoing with Billboard Chris. However, Cook will be finishing up at ACON after 12 years. The Victorian Government has just launched an ad campaign designed by trans and gender diverse people called The Unsaid Says a Lot. It includes videos, for instance, of a man who identifies as a trans woman entering an elevator and the woman inside it appearing uncomfortable and exiting the elevator before the doors close. The woman is depicted as making the trans woman feel unsafe. The campaign materials say that 3 in 4 trans and gender diverse people have been treated unfairly because of their gender identity, as though a woman feeling uncomfortable when she perceives a man in a dress sharing a lift with her is treating that man unfairly, and she should stop and stay in the lift, hiding her natural response. So the messaging of the campaign is that your feelings are wrong and should be suppressed if they make another person feel not fully embraced for how they present themselves or who they claim to be, and this will, of course, disproportionately impact women and children. The Queensland Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act came into effect on the 24th of June. The law allows a person to alter their sex on legal documents, such as their birth certificate, and parents can also choose how they identify in their parenting role on their child's birth certificate. So a man, for instance, can list himself as mother on the child's birth certificate. And someone with court-ordered parental responsibility for a child can make applications on the child's own behalf as well. So that started 5 days ago. On the 20th of June, journalist Bernard Lane published the results of his FOI request that showed that Australia's health minister was advised by his staff on the 16th of April after publication of the Cass Review that it was relevant to Australian gender treatment and that the Australian guidelines had failed review. The advice to the minister also provided general warnings regarding interventions such as puberty blockers, saying that there is, quote, a lack of robust evidence on the long-term benefits and outcomes. Since then, the minister has claimed that Cass is not relevant to Australia because of, quote, different care pathways, and a health department official told Parliament about a week ago, I think, that the Australian environment was different from the UK. Note that in 2023, our guidelines became even more lax and advised GPs to commence hormone therapy on teenagers without multidisciplinary backup or specialists, as long as they felt they had sufficient expertise or skill themselves. So this minister is the one that the Tasmanian government has asked to conduct an inquiry into child gender interventions instead of the Tasmanian government doing it itself. However, it's worth noting that they are of different political parties. A coronial inquest into the suicides of 5 people who identified as trans in and around 2021 is ongoing in Victoria. Last week, it was expanded in response to findings that one man had been damaged by an orchiectomy procedure, so removal of the testicles, done by an inexperienced backyard operator, and that this damage may have contributed to the decision to suicide. The reporting has focused blame on the barriers to accessing these interventions through authorised medical providers, so that may be the eventual recommendation to make it easier to have the procedures. On the 3rd of June, the New South Wales Parliamentary Committee inquiring into the Omnibus Equality Bills, that's the self-ID, surrogacy, prostitution, child medicalisation, etc., delivered its report after its inquiry and 2 days of hearings, it declined to give an opinion on the bill and referred it back to Parliament for debate. The 2-day hearing included women's groups, the Feminist Legal Clinic included, church groups, as well as pro-trans groups, and the committee's own public survey on the bill had 85% of respondents out of 13,258 respondents not support the bill. Only 13% of public respondents supported the bill. Louise Elliott, councillor on Hobart City Council, tried to book a council room in 2023 for a women's rights meeting in her private capacity. Her booking request and personal information was shared by the Lord Mayor with a pro-trans advocate. Now, that happens to be Rodney Croom, the one who brought the UN human rights case years ago against Tasmania's criminalisation of homosexuality. However, Croom is now more of a trans rights campaigner. Croom asked to meet with her and asked that she refuse the booking. Documents and emails showing this were then withheld from an FOI request. Elliott filed a complaint with the Tribunal for Discrimination, and conciliation resulted in a public apology from the council and compensation. Complaints regarding those breaches of privacy and FOI laws are ongoing, though, so we'll see how that turns out. The Australian Human Rights Commission held its free and equal conference on a proposed Federal Human Rights Act. The proposal for the Human Rights Act does not incorporate CEDAW. It focuses on 5 other human rights treaties, and it does not include sex-specific rights or the rights of women as a named rights area. An email was sent to speakers. There were 61 speakers at the conference. An email was sent to speakers regarding this omission of CEDAW, and 1 speaker responded. She said she was sure that the concerns regarding the omission of CEDAW and sex-based protections would be covered during the session on gender. They weren't. The panel consisted of 5 women and 1 man who presented himself as a trans woman, and Tickle and Giggle was discussed. I was not present, but I've heard reports that Giggle's actions were argued as an infringement on human rights example. President of the AHRC, Rosalind Croucher, is coming to the end of her term. Her replacement is Hugh de Kretser, former director of the Human Rights Law Centre and CEO of the Europe Justice Commission. De Kretser did support the 2013 amendments to the SDA and hasn't said anything that walks that back since. Equality Rights Alliance, which is a network of NFPs, they say coming together to advocate for gender equality and the human rights of, quote, women, girls, and people of marginalised genders, works with the federal government and the United Nations. The convener, Helen Daly-Fisher, has resigned. She'll be farewelled at the ERA conference this coming week. No news on her replacement yet, and actually, the YWCA has announced that it will not be receiving federal government funding to continue running the ERA in the future. We don't know why, but this means that the ERA will cease to exist in its current capacity unless it evolves into a body separate from the YWCA and obtains funding in some other way. So this could leave Australia without a peak coordination body for women's rights groups and a funding gap. There is currently a federal family court matter ongoing that challenges the outdated common law rules for children giving informed consent to medical interventions if the parents disagree. That is still ongoing. It was scheduled, I think, for 2 days and has now been running for about 5 weeks. This is the one that you may have read about in The Australian, where the 2 sisters made a pact for the younger to give the elder her eggs in the future because the elder had been told about the fertility impacts of testosterone. The Caste review has been argued in that court case by barrister Bell Lane, but the judge has refused to allow the report, my understanding is, to be admitted into evidence. There are also 2 other, I believe, family court matters looking at informed consent ongoing at the moment. 2 cases regarding the Sex Discrimination Act, that's Tickle and Giggle, which should have its judgment in July, maybe early August. And the Lesbian Action Group case, which is scheduled for September in the AAT. There's at least 1 vilification discrimination case on foot for misgendering. This one was criticising a man feeding his baby chemically stimulated nipple discharge. There's at least one wrongful dismissal matter, Gillian Spencer. I might be forgetting some, but there are a lot of matters to keep our eye on over the next 6 months. And two last bits of news, which are a little bit of a call for action if they relate to you. Dr. Cass is giving a webinar with the National Association of Practicing Psychiatrists on the 2nd of July in just a couple of days' time. And registration, I believe, is still possible, but there is a fee involved. And lastly, member of the New South Wales Legislative Council, Greg Donnelly, gave a speech in Parliament in support of women's sports, and he launched a public petition against the still on foot equality bill for New South Wales residents. The petition is hosted on the New South Wales Parliament website because it's an official parliamentary petition, so it is only open for New South Wales residents. It's open until the 10th of September though, so if you are a New South Wales resident, you may want to hop along and put your name on that. It's in response to the committee's handballing of the issue back to Parliament for, quote, further debate. So long, June, and thanks for all the fish.
And so long, Megan, and thanks for all the fish. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic wrap-up. I'd love to get one of those every month. Fantastic. Thank you
My pleasure.
so much.
Thanks very much.
Nice. It was great to have you. Passing over to Denise. Denise.
And hello again. At the moment, I've been writing a rather lengthy critique of transgenderism, which I've been putting up on my website as I finish each chapter. But the chapter I'm writing at the moment is called "Where's the Evidence?" It's a discussion of the evidence transgender uses to justify itself, or more precisely, the lack of evidence. Now, it might be assumed that with the release of the final report of Dr. Cass's investigation, there's no need for further commentary on the evidence or lack of it, for the benefits or otherwise of transgender medical procedures. After all, Cass found that, and I quote, "This is an area of remarkably weak evidence," unquote. Cass is Dr. Hilary Cass is an honorary physician in paediatric disability. She's retired, but she's still a consultant. And she's a past president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. And she was asked by the National Health Service England to chair the review. In part, it's a summary of the findings of 6 commissioned systematic reviews of studies of research on children and adolescents referred to gender services, plus 2 reviews of international guidelines and an outline survey of gender services for children and adolescents. All of this research was carried out by researchers at the University of York, which, like most, if not all, universities in the United Kingdom, has been thoroughly captured, but at least the researchers did their job, at least up to a point. All of them actually were women. I think there was one man, but most of them were women. All of these are published separately from the Cass report, although they're referenced there. Cass summoned up the results of the systematic reviews as follows. The University of York's systematic reviews demonstrated poor study design, inadequate follow-up periods, and a lack of objectivity in reporting of results. As a result, the evidence for the indicated uses of puberty blockers and masculinizing, feminizing hormones in adolescents are unproven, and benefits, harms are unknown. Hence, the claims by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health in its version 8 of its standards of care are, as I said, quote, based upon a more rigorous and methodological evidence-based approach than previous versions, has been found, not surprisingly, to be false. So the Cass report has received a rapturous response from many of transgender's critics, Julie Bindel called it a victory for women, children and common sense. She believed that it had brought us one step closer to throwing the harmful delusion that is gender ideology into the dustbin of history. Bernard Lane, who's been a major critic in the Australian press of the transgender medical treatment of children since 2019, said that the Cass report holds up a snapshot of missing data, cluelessness and fudging of evidence in gender medicine around the world. Graham Linehan said he was proud as punch, and J.K. Rowling said, "The review's conclusions will have come as a seismic shock to those who've hounded and demonised whistleblowers and smeared opponents as bigots and transphobes." The trans lobby, of course, was not pleased with the Cass report. Their first complaint arrived even before it had been released. It emanated from a trans activist calling himself Alejandro Caraballo. Sorry about my Spanish accent, Marietta. Who started with the internet slang TLDR, which stands for too long, didn't read. A statement that was more than borne out by what else he went on to say. He tweeted what appeared to be a direct quote of something said in the Cass review. And I'm quoting what he said. The Cass review said, "We disregarded nearly all the studies because they weren't double-blinded controlled studies. We also stopped reviewing newer studies released in the last 2 years. As a result, we were left with very little evidence," unquote. This is a blatant lie, and it's easily checked. No such statement appears anywhere in Cass's final report, and neither does it appear in either of the 2020 reviews by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, that he went on to quote in a screenshot, alleging that they came from the Cass report when they didn't. The trans lobby's reactions varied from the outrageous, their usual anonymous death threats to Cass herself, which the police took seriously enough to advise her not to take public transport, to the usual denial and lies. The criticisms most often repeated by the trans lobby were that the review had included only 2 out of 103 studies of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and that it discussed only random controlled trials. The reference to 2 out of 103 studies is probably a misreading of what the report actually said about those studies. The review found 50 studies of puberty blockers, only 1 of which was of high quality, while 25 were of moderate quality and 24 were of low quality. The 24 low-quality studies were excluded from the reported results because their conclusions were unreliable. The other 26 were included. The 26 moderate quality ones were included. Then there were 53 studies of cross-sex hormones, and again, only 1 was of high quality. But all were included in the reported results. There were only 2 high-quality studies, but they were not the only studies included in the report. Indeed, it was because the studies were of only low or moderate quality that the review found the evidence was remarkably weak. Moreover, Cass did not reject research that was not a random controlled trial. None of the studies discussed in the report were random controlled trials. All she said about random controlled trials was that they were the gold standard of research and that there are hardly any random controlled trials in studies investigating children and young people receiving endocrine treatment for gender incongruence dysphoria, unquote. Stonewall responded as though the Cass review was merely reiterating views that Stonewall itself had held all along, while any criticism was directed towards NHS England, but not to the review. They managed to pick up areas where Cass agreed with them, justified at least in part by Cass's own acceptance of the transgender agenda, and I'll come to that in a minute. For example, Stonewall said that the review argues that the evidence on puberty blockers is insufficient, but also acknowledges their efficacy for some trans young people, and the review did not call for blanket bans on puberty blockers. Both of these statements are accurate. Former Stonewall CEO Ruth Hunt was less accurate. She was reported in the Times to have protested Stonewall's innocence. They had simply trusted the experts, she said. Mermaids also claimed innocence. Their CEO, Lauren Stoner, had her own version of the leaving it to the experts denial. She was reported to have told Sky News, "We were commissioned to provide some focus groups to the CAS review, but otherwise we're not clinical professionals. We don't get involved in the decisions that are made between a young person, their family, and their clinicians," unquote. J.K. Rowling's reaction to this was typically forthright. Stoner's response was, she said, "total, shameless lies." Mermaid's fingerprints, she said, are all over the catastrophe of child transition. WPATH lied too, but I don't have time to go into that here. Cass didn't respond in detail to her detractors. She did presumably avoid public transport, and she said she stayed away from X. She did object to what she called the disinformation being spread by trans activists and influential figures such as the Labor MP Dawn Butler, that she had discarded most of the research. But while the trans lobby's criticisms are either false or deranged, for example, the hashtag #CassKillsKids from broadcaster and trans activist India Willoughby, there are reasonable objections that can be raised to the CAS review. One example is the review's both sides assertions, implying that both transgender and its critics are equally responsible for the toxicity and polarisation of the controversy surrounding the use of medical treatments. To give just one example of Cass's both sides argument, she said, "Despite the best intentions of everyone with a stake in this complex issue," I love that word complex too, it's a juju word meaning I can't decide between two things, and I'm not going to tell you anyway. So despite the best intentions of everyone with a stake in this complex issue, the toxicity of the debate is exceptional. I have faced criticism by transgenders critics, but she doesn't say so, for engaging with groups and individuals who have a social justice approach and advocate for gender affirmation, and have equally been criticised by the trans lobby, but she doesn't say so, for involving groups and individuals who urge more caution. There are few other areas of healthcare where professionals are so afraid to openly discuss their views, where people are vilified on social media, and where name-calling echoes the worst bullying behaviour. This must stop, she said. But it's not going to stop if the culprits are not accurately identified. It's not the critics of gender affirmation who are responsible for the increasingly hostile and polarised debate. It's not people on all sides of the debate who exaggerate or misrepresent the results of studies. It's the transgender activists, and she doesn't admit this. So neither Cass nor the University of York consulted any of the critics. They said that they prioritised two categories of stakeholders: people with relevant experience and organisations working with LGBTQ+ children and young people generally, and clinicians and other relevant professionals with responsibility for providing care and support to children and young people within specialist gender services. So they only spoke to the medical professionals who are working in the area and the trans lobby, actually, organisations working with alphabet soup children. Neither outspoken trans-critical women like Julie Bindel and Heather Brunskill-Evans and Julie Birchall and Stephanie Davis-Arai and Sheila Jeffries and Helen Joyce and Kathleen Stock, to name just a few, nor women's organisations defending women's sex-based rights, nor those who have created trans-critical websites and blogs were included as stakeholders. The review contained no mention of any of the over 70 resources that I list on the transgender homepage of my website. While most of these sources are not the formal academic peer-reviewed research included in the systematic reviews by the University of York, neither is the information provided by the focus groups of transgender young people or by the trans lobby, who are euphemistically named support and advocacy groups. There are also a number of other problems with the review. There's the language used, the acceptance of transgender terminology. Whenever the word women, woman appears in the report, it's usually coupled with transgender or trans, although on one occasion it has the cis prefix tacked on, an adult cis woman. Cisgender appears a number of times, used as though it meant something. Did Cass not know it referred to her? I would have thought she would have been insulted by being referred to with that term. I certainly am. There's the recommendation that using puberty blockers in research is acceptable. She criticises GIDS, Gender Identity Development Service or whatever it was, for dosing the young with puberty blockers, despite the fact that their own research showed no benefit and even some negative effects for girls, namely a worsening of internalising problems, depression, anxiety. There's also the euphemising. So the review says, from 2014, puberty blockers moved from a research-only protocol to being available through routine clinical practice. And then it says, the rationale for this is unclear. A short while later, the review says, the adoption of a medical treatment with uncertain risks, based on an unpublished trial that did not demonstrate clear benefit, is a departure from normal clinical practice. But it's not just a matter of lack of clarity or departure from normal practice, that GIDS should ignore evidence suggesting caution, no indication of improvement and some indication of worsening, and then try to hide these results is nothing short of scandalous. The appropriate response is outrage, not pallid euphemisms. There's also the assumption that the weakness of the evidence was inadvertent and could be remedied with better designed research and some good advice. In other words, it implies goodwill on the part of transgender researchers. But the review's researchers came across at least one instance of bad faith on the part of the transgender medical profession, apart from the weakness of the research studies. Attempts to improve the evidence base, the review said in its summary, have been thwarted by a lack of cooperation from the adult gender services. The University of York said in its overview of study development that 6 of the 7 adult clinics declined to support the data linkage study. A table lists the reasons clinics gave for refusing to participate in the study, together with the university researchers' response. For example, the clinics said that extracting the data would be too labour-intensive because some of the records were still paper-based. The university replied, support is in place to cover clinics' workload in relation to research studies, including extraction of clinical data. The university answered every one of the clinic's objections to no avail. But all these problems are the consequences of accepting the assumption that there are children and young people who need to change into the opposite sex, and that it is possible to achieve that. Cass makes that acceptance quite clear in the first sentence of her foreword. This review, she said, is not about defining what it means to be trans, nor is it about undermining the validity of trans identities, challenging the right of people to express themselves, or rolling back on people's rights to health care. Still, the review did acknowledge and emphasise the weakness of the evidence. And in that sense, it's a step towards the final defeat of the transgender agenda. The finding that the supposed evidence for the efficacy of transgender medical treatments is remarkably weak, even though that's a euphemism for non-existent, is a welcome addition to the growing list of transcritical resources, equivocal though it might be. It's not, however, the last word on evidence, both for all the reasons I've already mentioned, and because the review was confined to medical treatments for children and young people. The problem of remarkably weak evidence, not to mention deliberate obfuscation, is not confined to that context. The Cass report had nothing to say about censorship operating in the universities and academic journals, where research happens and is reported, nor was there any realisation that most of the information transgender appeals to is in the form of bold assertions unsubstantiated by any argument or evidence. Then I go on to discuss that in the rest of the chapter, but not here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you. I can see applause happening, so that's excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Alecia and your little friend, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Alecia, Maternity Consumer Network. I love to talk maternity issues. I often say it's the feminist issue that has been forgotten. Back in, I guess, to give you a little bit of history for those that are unfamiliar with why the maternity system is such a problem and so violent to women, back in 2010 we actually had a landmark global review and research into the violence and disrespect against women in childbirth by Bowser and Hill that actually gave rise to the Respectful Maternity Care Charter. I will quickly go through basically the categories of disrespect. So there was a continuum from basically verbal abuse right up to physical abuse and detainment in facilities. I guess the biggest thing that we see in the maternity setting in Australia is a lot of coercion, a lot of non-consented care. What the Bowser and Hill report did was actually gave rise to what we know as now the Respectful Maternity Care Charter. That was put out by White Ribbon Alliance, and they outlined 7 basically rights that women have, and that was underpinned by basically international law around human rights. So freedom from harm, right to information, informed consent and refusal, respect of choices, confidentiality, privacy, dignity, respect, equality, freedom from discrimination, right to timely health care, the right to highest attainable care, autonomy, self-determination, and freedom from coercion. Though 13 years on, we've not seen a lot of that. I would say, if anything, that our maternity system has certainly gotten more violent and more disrespectful in this country. We know it's a form of gender-based violence. In 2019, the UN had flagged it as an issue, as an international issue, but Australia certainly isn't immune from it. Basically, the UN had said the violence and disrespect against women in society has infiltrated the birth suite. The problem is that it is often sanctioned abuse, and women have very few avenues to basically get any kind of retribution for their abuse and mistreatment. The common themes for the New South Wales birth trauma inquiry, so they had over 4,000 submissions as an organisation, because the parliamentary submissions are quite difficult for women, particularly those coming from a non-English speaking background, those with, I guess, low political literacy, and those websites are quite clunky. We actually converted the terms of reference into a jot form and helped the committee that way, and we had over 700 submissions alone. In that cohort of women, over 67% had said that they had not consented to procedures, which is quite significant. And we know that if this had occurred in the car park, it would constitute assault. But it's not seen as assault in the maternity setting. There is the prioritisation of the fetus over the mother, even though that we know the fetus actually doesn't have rights. And we've got an increase in termination access for women, but it seems to be there are still huge cultural barriers to overcome, as the woman being seen as a mere vessel to carry a baby. So the birth trauma inquiry, what we also saw overall, the common themes were exactly what we're seeing in almost every lot of research done since that 2010 landmark report, is violent, disrespectful care and lack of informed consent. It also looked at obstetric violence. So now we have an internationally recognised term called obstetric violence, which is the gender-based violence in the maternity setting. And basically all the things that I've mentioned, from the coercion and verbal abuse right up to the physical abuse, comes under that umbrella term for obstetric violence. Interestingly, that New South Wales birth trauma inquiry, as far as I'm aware, is the first internationally, but the UK has followed suit. We were lucky that we didn't lose gendered language in the inquiry, which is almost, I don't know, a unicorn, because I see the loss of women happening, the word woman happening in this space quite a lot as well. During COVID, so there was a birth experience study, which is the biggest study that we've seen in the country around capturing women's experience. There was 8,800 women, and that was from a range of backgrounds. That study and survey was translated into other languages as well. The common themes of comments from that birth experience study were dehumanised, powerless and violated. So unfortunately, that is the way women are starting their experience of motherhood. We know also, so that data was the same as what we've seen over many years of any data capturing, that 1/3 of women experience birth trauma, which is about 100,000 women a year. So as far as mental health in that perinatal period, trauma has now overtaken postnatal depression and anxiety. So some of the ways in which women were actually asked about their experience was using the Respectful Maternity Care Charter. So consumers, we're not even doing this well in this country compared to places like the US and Canada, who seem to be well and truly ahead in collecting women's experiences. But we have from there that could be used in Australia, because it is validated, is a mistreatment index. So it actually aligns with those 7 categories of disrespect and corresponding rights for women. We also know that there's a Mothers on Respect index that looked at how the woman basically, was she comfortable asking questions, was she not gaslit and things like that, and also autonomy in decision making. What I find interesting is that there is no state, territory or even federal government interested in collecting women's experience. So basically, they know that we have huge rates of trauma, huge rates of disrespect and abuse, and they are not interested in collecting this data at hospital level. So we will continue to have to rely on independent research and funding to collate and collect women's experience. But 8,800 women, it is quite a decent sized study. But if we look at all birthing women in Australia each year, it's 300,000. So even since this study, we've had 1 million women birth, and we're just collecting basically a drop in the ocean. So that's about it for the maternity setting. It's pretty grim, unfortunately. It's like I said, I often think it's the issue that feminists have forgotten, but at least we did get a birth trauma inquiry. There are about 42 recommendations that I reckon are going to collect dust unless we start banging on Health Minister Ryan Parker's door.
Thank you, and thank you to your helper. So lovely to see her.
The boob monster.
Lovely. How wonderful. I love having a boob monster on the show. So I would like to thank our 2 remaining speakers because Megan had to dash off. Thank you, Alecia. Thank you, Denise. Thought-provoking, fantastic, so great. So I'm going to switch off the recording and then we'll promote women to panelists, and you can put your hand up and ask questions, or you can put questions in the Q&A.